If you ask most car experts, they'll say that Chinese EVs like the brand BYD are dollar for dollar better in every meaningful way than a comparable Tesla. My own experience is that is pretty much true as well. China is completely dominant in solar panels and batteries and wind power. They are set to dominate the EV sector as well. And then we get to watches. Some people say China makes better watches than the Swiss at much lower prices. Nothing Switzerland can do can outcompete the Chinese. The Swiss watch market is going to be crushed by the Chinese brands. That's the talk. Is it true? Is Switzerland set for a future collapse where China swoops in and completely destroys the Swiss dominance of the luxury watch industry? Let's dive in. How did China get so strong? We're not going to get too much into the political stuff. We're just going to stick with the practical consequences of the way China and the Chinese government works with the private sector. Today, China is the world's manufacturing center. They have an almost complete stranglehold on pretty much every kind of mass production. That goes for cars, batteries, phones, solar panels, and a million other things. Ultra streamlined playbook China runs. It's all about public-private partnerships, but not in the vague boardroom buzzword kind of way. Here's how it goes. Step one, the government spots a sector they want to dominate. So EV, solar panels, whatever strategic for the next phase of growth for China. And they go, we really need to be good at this. Step two, they throw the doors wide open. Subsidies, grants, support. If you're a Chinese company and you want to jump into that space, here's your seed capital. You can go wild, build your thing. Step three is a cage match, a free market one. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of companies enter the ring, and it's brutal. It's free market chaos, but inside a Chinese sandbox. And most of the companies go under. But the ones that survive are sharp. They've iterated fast, they've built better tech, they've carved out real competitive edges. Now, in step four, when the field's been thinned, the government steps back in and says, great, we've got our champions, and it starts helping those winners scale. Big time. It's infrastructure, it's trade deals, it's global marketing, whatever they need to take their product to the rest of the world. And in step five, the best of the best don't just show up overseas, they dominate. And there are criticisms, wage suppression, currency tricks, shady stuff on the margins, but a huge part of their dominance isn't about being cheap. It's because the products are actually excellent. They are genuinely often best in class or neck and neck with the Western rivals. It's not knockoff junk. It's world-leading quality with excellent pricing. When China focuses on something, the power they put behind it is geared towards them ending up making some of the best manufactured products out there. On top of that, they also end up building a supply chain infrastructure that is incredibly competitive and incredibly efficient. If you go to an American company or a European company and say to them that you need them to build something for you, it's going to take them a year or two before your product is scaled up. If you go to China, they can scale it up in 3 or 6 months in the quantities and qualities that you need. This is, whether you like it or not, the reality of Chinese manufacturing as a whole. The reality of YouTube is that likes and subscribes and comments are what tell me whether or not I'm making good videos. So if you're still here, then it's reasonable to assume that I've made a video that you find worthy of your time. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and subscribe if you're new. It's hugely appreciated. Thanks. Next step, take a look at this watch. How many components are there in this watch? How many steps go into making this watch? And I don't want to get into the complete nitty-gritty of this, but so let's just stick with something like the bracelet. What are the parts? There are center links, there are end links, there are spring bars, and spring bars have springs and bars. There's screws, there's lug things, there's clasps, ratchets, levers, lockers, all sorts of stuff onto the bracelet. It's not just a clasp and a bracelet. And here's something you need to get your head around. And this applies to watch manufacturing, it applies to a lot of things. Just like in the PC world, every single base component can, in theory, come from a different specialist. There might be a company that does nothing but screws for bracelets. And there might just be a company that only makes ratchets. One does end links, one just polishes. Some only make boxes. It can potentially be that specific. I watched this video on motherboards the other day, and it's the same idea. And one sub-vendor was making all the USB headers for every major board maker. Watches, in principle, work the same way. At the very least, you've got firms that only make bracelets or only specialize in cases or dials. In practice, it's not down to a case that only does collars for pushpins, but it's a really specialized network. It's not one big mega factory in China or Switzerland cranking out a full watch. It's a network, a supply, a web of specialists. Everyone shops around for exactly what they need at the right quality and the price they want it at. Swiss brands do this, Chinese brands do it. Saint Martin uses Seiko and Miyota movements. Atelier Wen might use a local Dandong movement in one model and a Swiss movement in another. So forget generally the idea of one brand building everything in-house. Whether it's a Swiss or Chinese watch on your wrist, chances are it's mostly and more often than not a result of dozens of expert suppliers all doing their part. There are exceptions, but this is, broadly speaking, the industry. How good are Chinese watches right now? Hopefully you didn't skip ahead to here because all that stuff was relevant, because you need to understand those parts to be able to appreciate how you answer the question of how good Chinese watches are right now. I've said it before in other videos. I think you can categorize watch quality into 5 boxes. It's the manufacturing of the movement. It's the manufacturing of the case, clasp, dial, so the externals. It's the design and creativity of the watch. It's the brand identity. And it's the sort of handmade craft that goes with manufacturing. So it's a continuum, but sort of the true handmade it is like guilloche and anglage and perlage and whatever you want to call it. That's the 5 components. Now, for simplicity's sake, and for now, I'm sticking with mass market, mass production offerings. I'll get back to the high end, but let's just focus on what mass market offerings there are from Chinese manufacturers. And let's start with movements. I think we have to differentiate between low end, mid range, and high end just in that space as well. At the entry level, China makes movements that are more or less directly competing with Miyota, Seiko on movements like, the NH35. They're not always completely on par. They deliver good value. Quality control might not always be there, but it's a close race. In the mid-tier, the Swiss brands still have an edge. Sellita, lower-end ETA are still ahead in terms of durability, material choices, brand trust, consistency, quality control. The Chinese brands are not on par, and the higher up in grade you go, the wider the gap is. There's nothing comparable with a Rolex Dynapulse movement or escapement from a Chinese manufacturer. Also, on a more aesthetic level, the Western mass-produced upper-tier movements tend to be finished better. In the really high end, the Chinese have made leaps in terms of really complex movements and skeletonization. The prices are also far below those of Western brands. But again, long-term reliability is still a question. And on balance, they're not consistently competitive in terms of refinement and finishing. And honestly, in the high end, collector trust and desire just isn't there yet. I mean, that could be a craft thing, but it still applies. Then there's craft. Atelier Wen, as an example, do some really cool stuff that leans towards the higher end. On occasion, you see watches or individual component workmanship that is a very high level. But on a sort of monolithic country level, on a macro level, China's not the best. The locus of skill and knowledge for really high-end luxury watchmaking craft is Glashütte, Switzerland, and somewhere in Japan. China doesn't at this point have a position where they are seen as a craft country. Switzerland is. Glashütte is. This is in part down to identity, but it is also down to Chinese luxury watches, if looked at as a monolith, not just being there yet. Design and originality is always subjective. What I find ugly, you might find good looking, and vice versa. So I'll weigh my words carefully. I think Atelier Wen, as an example, show that design and creativity are not something Chinese brands are incapable of. Of course they can. I do, however, believe that historically, creativity and design that appeals to Western audiences hasn't been there. And still, to a large extent, it isn't seen in the mass market segment as a priority. So it's not a skill thing, it's a priority thing. In the minds of most Western customers, I don't think the design-led Chinese brands take up a lot of headspace. Saint Martin and other factory brands are first and foremost known for affordable replicas at mass market divers, sports watches and chronos, and they're not known broadly because of their own design language. The rest of the Chinese space is largely unknown to us in the West. You'll be hard-pressed to find a lot of Westerners outside of the watch community, which is small, that know of Atelier Wen, Ming or others. And identity? No Chinese brand has the status globally of Seiko, Rolex, AP, Omega, Tudor, Longines, Breitling, Tissot. There are brands like Seeger Design and local luxury brands that are not, trying to be factory brands, but apart from a small niche of Western enthusiasts, they're not really stealing brand recognition from Rolex or AP at this point in time. So I left case and bracelet and all other external manufacturing bits for last. And here's where that whole components part discussion comes back into play. How good is China at this stuff? Honestly, pretty damn good. In a lot of areas, they are on par with the Swiss. And in some cases, they're literally the ones supplying the Swiss with the parts. Can they polish a case to the level of Rolex? Probably yes. Can they bevel lug edges as sharply as a Swiss high-end piece? Yep, absolutely. What they usually don't match is the extreme refinement of something like a multi-layered case finishing you see on a Nautilus or an Ingenieur. That's still very much a Swiss flex. But when it comes to what, I'm going to call it bulk skills for lack of a better term, polishing, brushing, machining, case tolerances, they can absolutely match Swiss quality when they choose to. And that part matters. It's when they choose to. Because here's the thing about manufacturing. Getting to 80 or 90% of Rolex quality is actually not that hard. It's also relatively cheap to do. But the last 10% or 5% or 3%, that's where it gets really expensive. That's where Swiss brands pour money into micro-finishing, manual labor, and hyper-consistent tolerances and clearances. And also super obsessive quality control. There's a great video of a watchmaker comparing a high-end fake to a Rolex, and those fakes get really close. But when you zoom in on the details, that final 1 to 3%, that's where you start to see where the corners are cut. And the corners are cut because for them, and them is the Chinese, it's also about hitting a price point. The extra cost that goes into those last couple of percentage points are not worth it. And for the low-end factory brands, there's a limit to how far they'll go. They're also focusing on a price point. For them, good enough is what they're trying to hit, not perfectly exactly the same. I'm going to park baking the whole identity thing into the equation. So for the rest, movement, general manufacturing, design, and craft, Chinese watches, on a whole, are not generally on par with a full package Swiss watch. The place where the gap is the smallest is that base manufacturing. The rest is still with the Swiss ahead by a country mile. And I can see the comments heating up already. Just so you know, I actually wrote to 3 Chinese manufacturers and asked them these same questions about where they are in skill. One of them responded basically with a ChatGPT response, and that was quite clear. But the other 2 took the time to respond in detail. And they they gave me this exact same picture. So that's where they are. For me, it leads to 2 more questions that need answering. Could they catch up on all these parameters? And 2, will they catch up on all these parameters? Could they? Let's run through them all quickly this time. Are there people in China who could have the creative skill to design consistently appealing original designs? Absolutely. The Swiss are not inherently more creative. There are also some high-end luxury Chinese brands that I've seen that have some really good-looking original designs. Would there also in China be people that could learn to hand engrave, guilloche, and all that other stuff to a level that can compete with the best A. Lange and Söhne has to offer? It's 1.2 billion people again. Absolutely, of course they can. There's nothing stopping any Chinese brand from competing one-to-one in terms of craft with any Western brand over time. The number that do right now is limited, but there are examples of Chinese brands that are moving in that direction. Then we've got movements and that base manufacturing, case and dialing, bracelets and that stuff. Could the general level of a fully Chinese-made watch eventually get to the point where the movement inside is as or even better or more advanced than something the Swiss are doing? Absolutely, positively. And can some Chinese company get to a point where they can build and finish a case to the degree that Rolex does end to end with the same materials from start to finish and also compete on a manufacturing level? No discussion. Of course they can. If some Chinese mass manufacturers wanted to go entirely head-to-head with Rolex on manufacturing quality, it's completely feasible that they could end up doing it. It's not going to be an overnight thing, but on the manufacturing of the body, this is where they're by far the closest. There's more of a gap to the West when it comes to the mass-produced movement, but it's one they can close, and they will likely be able to produce it cheaper than most, pretty much anything primarily produced in the West. At the core of all of this is that China's future competitive advantage right now is in case and body manufacturing. Over time, they can expand that myriad of suppliers and skill sets to movements in the mid-range and high-end as well. They could eventually get to a point where they do those two things as well as the Swiss on all parameters at a cheaper price point, excluding tariffs, of course. But they don't have a competitive advantage in design, craft, or brand building. Chinese solar panels are the best in the world, apparently, but they're not prettier than our solar panels, and they generate no emotional connection. Those three details are important: brand, craft, design. Now, is there a world where a Chinese watch can have a brand identity that rivals Rolex? In theory, yes. But the reality is building a brand perception to the level of Patek or Audemars Piguet or Rolex takes time and money. Now, there's absolutely some billionaire out there that would like to try, but this isn't an overnight thing. Building brand equity takes a lot of money and a lot of time. It's more realistic to see a brand at the level of Formex or Christopher Ward or other European microbrands. Simply put, the more high-end you go, the less it's about price point and the more it's about the identity that comes with your watch. I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that a lot of high-end Patek buyers are not going to be convinced by a Chinese brand they don't know to buy a watch that is just as good in every way, but just cheaper. People want a Patek because it's a Patek. No amount of discount is going to convince those kind of people to switch, at least not initially. So that brings us to, will they? Will they destroy the Western watch world? No, but they are going to have an impact. And it all depends on a couple of things. Right now, I think you have to segment this monolith that is Chinese watch brands into at least three buckets. There's the factory brands like San Martin and company. We'll call that the low end. There's the niche but affordable consumer brands like Seeger and Atelier Wen, which all go, all the way up to Rolex level in my mind, in principle at least. And then there's the high-end specialty space. With the factory brands, as far as I can tell, these brands have not demonstrated, to me at least, that they really want to be much more than what they are right now. They very much seem content with being in the affordable space with a good level of manufacturing. Not 100% of Rolex or Tudor or whoever, but a solid 80 or 90% or some number where you get a lot for your money, but with some compromises. They seem fine with throwing in low-end movements and haven't really shown any interest in partnering with somebody to make a competitive alternative to a cost level high-grade Sellita SW200. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, if they have, and I just haven't seen the press release. But for me, these brands feel like a storefront that is there to show other brands what they can produce for them more than a strong primary consumer arm. They don't do any meaningful brand building, and whether you want to accept it or not, part of the appeal of Hamilton, Tissot, and Seiko is the brand that surrounds them, even just from a recognition perspective. These factory brands are more or less dependent on low costs and tariff exemptions to be compelling. I think the Western market for cheap, essentially no-name watches isn't that big. I don't see the factory brands investing in branding to make them more appealing in general to Western consumers. And sure, they'll take a small piece of the pie, but nothing in their behavior is indicating that they are trying to be an alternative to a Tissot PRX or a Hamilton or a Christopher Ward. They seem very happy to be where they are. Next up is brands like Seeger and Atelier Wen and Seagull and others. Seagull is actively and vocally investing in making better movements. What they'll come out with is unclear, but they do and say they want to do something. Atelier Wen have made a very clear case for themselves as a serious low, mid-range, sometimes even slightly high-end brand that makes good watches in terms of design, manufacturing, and craft. And their prices aren't necessarily cheaper than anything Swiss, but they're competing on level terms and they are rapidly closing the gap. Now, I don't want to get into Wen specifically, but what we're seeing with a brand like this is two things. If you throw money at it, you will see a mid-range Chinese watch that is completely competitive with anything Swiss at a similar price. But they also throw marketing money at those customers. They know it's not just about original designs and quality, but very much also about storytelling. This approach has potential to compete entirely against any comparable Western brand. It also has the potential to push some Western brands to innovate more in terms of technique to justify their price premiums. The second thing is, it's China first. IWC makes one Chinese New Year watch every year, or maybe two, not that many. For China, they maybe do a couple of color variants, but generally speaking, what they sell in the West is the same as they sell in China. But what does Wen do? All their watches lean heavily into China, Chinese design, Chinese heritage, and in a way, Chinese aesthetic sensibilities. I mean, did you know that the Perceptions case is designed to mimic that of a classic Chinese pagoda? There are going to be more of these kinds of brands, and their first concern is not with conquering the Western market. It's with gaining share in the Chinese and Chinese adjacent markets. Just like Volkswagen and Porsche are having a tough time in China, so will the mid-range brands have a tough time in China. I'll even go so far as to say that even brands like Rolex can't be guaranteed that their brand status that they have in the West is a given in the future in China. Again, I'm not seeing a collapse of Western brands in the West. The potential savings for a entirely like-for-like product is not quite as big as people might assume when you factor in brand building and marketing costs. This was never solely down to who makes the same quality for a lower price. People pay for brand even at this price point, and the Chinese brands know this because they're also throwing money at branding. The prize, though, is the Chinese market, not the Western market, at least not now. Finally, you've got the high end. You can find high-end Chinese movements and watches that cost $20,000, $30,000, $50,000. I was at a watch meet not long ago, and one guy who knew a lot more than me about the high-end Chinese watch industry tested my knowledge of Chinese watchmaking. And he spoke of a brand, forget the name, but they made I think it was a flying tourbillon that cost only $30,000. And he was making the point that it was markedly cheaper for that kind of complication compared to similar tourbillons from Western brands. He also made the case that it was the same quality. And on the one hand, I was amazed. All that watchmaking for all that much less. But since then, I've kept coming back to one thing. When anyone buys a Patek or an AP or a Jean or a Moser, they're buying it because it's good, for sure, but they're also buying it because it's a Patek, a Jean, or an AP. Whether it's $30,000 or $100,000 is not important to them. Cheaper and just as good is an entirely irrelevant selling point at this price point. There might be a few enthusiasts that want this niche offering at a relative bargain, but most Jean customers are customers with Jean because it's a Jean. Jean can't half-ass their products, of course, but the name and the trust associated with and the credibility is part of the price. And it brings me back to the point of those 5 criteria. Can China make a movement or a complication as well as some Western brand? Yes. Eventually, in the mass market, they probably will as well. They can manufacture a superb case. They can make a beautiful design. They can craft it like the greatest Patek watchmaker eventually. Well, there must be one out there already. There's 1.2 billion people. Must be there. Is there a Chinese Roger Smith out there? Absolutely. But in the high end, it's the identity that sets you apart. Those brands have to win GPHG, just like the Western brands. They need to get that critical acclaim, and they need to build an identity that conjures up trust and desire and aspiration. Again, there's a huge potential to do that in China, to be the preeminent greatest Chinese watchmaker of all time. In the West, outside of some niche enthusiasts, a lower price gives them no advantage. They have to do what Jean, Acrivia, and Groeneveld do, and all the others do at that high end, on a level playing field. As an individual, I like to think that I have a reasonably objective approach to assessing the Chinese watch industry as a whole versus the Western industry. The Western brands are, on balance, still ahead when it comes to a lot of things, but especially on manufacturing, broadly speaking, the gap is either small or at a minimum closing very soon. I'm under no illusion that anything Rolex or Omega is capable of is out of the realm of possibility for a Chinese brand to eventually, and in a shorter time than we might think, be able to do as well if they choose to do so. But I keep coming back to the fact that identity is what most people buy when it comes to jewelry. Identity is part of the price for pretty much everything over $2,000. It's not just a price game. If it were, nobody would buy a Rolex. The gap between Omega and Rolex in terms of raw quality is so small that it can't possibly explain why a Seamaster 300M at 40% below the price of a Submariner is not consistently the one that gets picked. So if Omega can't convince everybody to buy their cheaper watch that is pretty much as good as the Rolex for less, then why would any Chinese brand be able to? It's not all brand, of course. Quality has to align with brand perception. Quality is also a differentiator. And the quality gap is definitely closing. And in some places, like I said, completely on par, but not everywhere. But the point is, identity has a value for millions of customers around the world. And it works for AP, it works for Rolex, and it works for Studio Underdog. China, though, as a consumer market, is a very different story. Here, the power of identity that Western brands have is not a given. Chinese customers will be swayed by compelling local storytelling. They are not married to IWC like you and I are. But more than anything, my take is that all this talk of boiling it down to price and quality is fine when it's a square box that needs to get you from A to B. It's also great when you want to buy an efficient windmill, but when it's about jewelry, which this is, it's about so much more. And there, China and the West are on a more level playing field, and low Chinese salaries are not the make or break feature of all customers' decisions. So that's my take. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments. There's no truth to this because this is an incredibly complex issue with so many factors. I don't claim to have the true answer. It's a perspective. I'm really curious to hear yours. Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.